Welcome to a fresh take from our new studio.
Yes, beautiful room. Doesn't the paint smell nice and fresh?
Yes, it does, and that's why I'm dizzy.
That's not the only reason why you're dizzy.
That's true. I'm Mark Pennell along with Paul Sartorelli. He's our pastor here at Trinity in Mentor, Ohio. And he has some knowledge that I don't. And I always ask questions that I think are important, and hopefully you do too. That's why we have called it Fresh Take. We're trying to go to subjects that maybe you, as a person searching or a new believer, maybe been one for many years, have about what's going on in the Word and how Jesus Christ really does transform our lives. Okay, I'm going to get right to it. This subject is
It's a great subject.
Oh, yeah.
It's a timely subject.
Oh, yeah.
It's thousands of years old, but it's as fresh as yesterday as well.
Before I was a believer, I thought it was not believable that the Bible was just a bunch of stories that had been written by a bunch of drunk people who had these imaginations. And then, of course, after I became a believer, I became very interested in when it was written. Not that I had doubt. I was just curious. I thought it was cool. Mm-hmm. The doubt that I had was gone. It was now finding the neat answers, like who was the first writer of the New Testament, or, who followed who and all that stuff. But can it be believed? That's an important question we're going to get to today.
Yeah. And I think a lot of our viewers hear a lot of voices, maybe read a lot of books that calls that into question. Maybe
we're not used to these mics here.
Yes, we are used to the lavaliers. Maybe your kids are now in college and they're getting courses that are calling it into question. So that's our subject today. And Ty Waardenburg is my colleague here at Trinity, and Ty is a graduate of Southwest Seminary in Fort Worth, a little west of where I went to school in Dallas. And he's a real student, loves to study. And right now, your area of study intensely is basically what Mark was talking about. Our Bibles, are they believable? Why are people throwing apples at it? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah, we have been thinking as a staff of how to really kind of spiritually help form, disciple, and equip families. And so we've looked at how can we develop some kind of significant spiritual milestones in the life of a kid. And then what does it mean to not just have these things happen in the life of a child, but to come alongside parents to equip them with that.
Oh, neat.
And so we're doing something new this fall that I've seen some other churches do, which is we're going to have a Bible presentation. So kids that are in second and third grade, we're going to bring them up and give them a Bible. And the reason is because that's when they start reading for comprehension.
Okay.
So we thought, okay, well, if we're going to give a child a Bible, maybe we should have a class to talk with the parents about why it's important to give this book to a child, right, and what it should look like for us as parents to trust it, to have confidence in it, to read it and apply it in our lives as followers of Christ, as parents, and all of those things. And
I'm a nut about history, and when I was first walked in here and saw the new studio and went, over there on the on your right side is an old Bible, and I was intrigued, and I wanted to find out when it was written. But that's so recent to what it was written.
Yes.
Right after Christ died.
Yeah.
Well, and over there on your left side, actually, I just brought it in for show, is the Greek New Testament. Just to remind everyone that the Bibles that we have, English Bibles, Italian Bibles for my friends watching from Italy, those have all been translated from the Greek text. We're talking about the New Testament. So let's get into this subject a little bit. Greek text, English text. How did we get our Bibles? How did we get to what's on our lap now?
Well, there was a period of transmission from writing and translating. Old Testament's pretty cut and dry. I mean, we can see a lot of the tradition that's been handed down and things, and have it happen over a period of years. When it comes,
how many years? 2,000?
Well, I think we can go back to like the 1400s, which was the time of Moses, and he's credited as the author, or at least the compiler, of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And so if we think of the time period of that as being the time that we have the covenant of God being handed to the people of God in these writings occurring, I think it's safe to think, in a conservative estimate, sometime around the 1400s is when we would at least see here's the phase of God's people coming and God's word being delivered to them.
The 1400s BC, I'm guessing, right?
I mean, something that's been helpful to me as we think through this is when we ask questions about trusting the Bible, part of the question is, who's asking? You know, are you wanting to believe? Are you not wanting to believe?
Yeah.
Are you curious? Because the answers can vary, I think, depending on what people are interested in hearing. And I think as believers, we can say, okay, well, at the very least, here's what we really have. But also, as believers, we can have confidence kind of going beyond this. And what I find interesting with the Old Testament is that there seems to be, in my mind, from Genesis to Malachi, this kind of covenantal framework that gives, I think, the why behind why we have the scriptures. So you think from the very beginning, when God makes his covenant with the people of Israel, we see God writing, or not God writing, but God delivering his word with the expectation that it would be written. And when you think of ancient cultures and when people would enter into covenants with people, it would be written down, and you would have kind of a format of what the head honcho, if you will, is entering into an agreement with someone that really doesn't have the political or economic clout.
Okay.
And so there's an initiator of this covenant, and there is a recipient, and they will write down the terms of the covenant.
Right.
And typically there'll be almost like a preamble of what this person has done for this person moving forward, what they will do, and kind of what the agreements are. And that's what we see occurring at Mount Sinai. But I think even in a bigger picture, that's what the whole Old Testament in many ways is it's kind of framed in a covenant where here are God's works, what he's done in the past, and his redemptive works that are recorded. And then here are the expectations of the people. And then you think of the Old Testament, and it's just example after example of them not meeting their expectations. Right. And they're breaking the covenant. And then if you look at the Old Testament and go to the last book of the Old Testament, it's the book of Malachi. The very last words are this: "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes, and he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction." Other translations say with a curse. Oh. So the very last word of the Old Testament is curse.
Interesting.
And if you think of the covenantal structure of things, they would end with blessings and cursings.
Interesting.
And the last thing is, if you don't, here's a curse. And then there's what we would call silence from heaven.
Hundreds of years.
Covenant that's how it ends, waiting for this Elijah to kind of come. And so I think when you look at the Old Testament and think of it as not just a collection of books, but really designed from beginning to end around this covenantal structure. And then they're just waiting for what's to come next.
And I heard once that they waited 400 years before the New Testament started. Is that right?
Something like that? They call it the silence of heaven. So, I mean, between the time that Malachi was finished to the time of the ministry of John the Baptist, there's about 400 years.
And remember what Jesus said about John the Baptist. He called him Elijah. Now, he wasn't Elijah reincarnated. He was sort of in the office of Elijah doing exactly what Ty just read. He was sort of the one that was presenting the new hope, the one who would do away with the curse that man's disobedience, that Israel's disobedience. So now we have Jesus. So let's move forward because we're talking about the Bible. Let's talk about how we get from the story of Jesus, the words of Jesus, through the apostles to our English Standard Version Bible. How do we get there?
This is where I've started to do a lot of reading to try to understand this because there's so much information out there. So it seems like from the time of Christ to the time of the first recorded transmissions we have of the Gospels, there's anywhere between 30, 40 or so years.
Okay.
And that there seems to be a strong oral tradition that occurred through that period.
Hold on, I have to interrupt. what he said to me was one of the most important things I had to tackle or overcome before I became a believer. Why did they wait so long to write down the story of Jesus Christ when he died in somewhere around 33? And I was just reading the other day, I'm reading the book of Mark right now, which was supposedly the first of the Gospels.
Do you only read the book by your name?
Yes, I do, because I'm more important.
And I only read Paul's epistles. That's it. I read nothing else. There's no Ty book. Oh, he's
the book of Ty. It doesn't quite work right. But anyway, what I was reading was that it was written, this commentator said that it was written around between 64 and 70. I had read that it was early as 45. So why is there such a discrepancy, and why is it that people are still wrestling with when it was written and how honest of an interpretation of the real words of Jesus Christ there?
Yeah, I think that when you talk about dating of the Gospels, it is a good question of what is the difference between the two. I think people tend to think Mark is the earliest.
Okay.
And so why people would put a later date on Mark might be to kind of just push the other Gospels kind of even further away from them, because there's a general consensus that Mark was the earliest. A couple of things I think to think of is even when we talk about pushing them even later, so someone like a skeptical guy like Bart Ehrman, who's still pretty fair-handed in some regards, will still date the Gospels to around 70s or 80s. Pretty much even conservative evangelical scholars think the Gospel of John is in the 90s. And so you've got John in the 90s. You've got some people putting Mark in like the 40s, some people putting Mark around 70. Regardless, you still have a gap of time where there's not written.
Right.
So you got to deal with that. And it's kind of like, okay, if it's 20 years, what's the difference really between 20 years and 40 years? So we still got to kind of handle that.
So why was that? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
And along with why was that, how did it happen? So the why, okay, those guys were getting their life together. The church was just getting started. They were beginning to formulate the stories. How then did the stories of Jesus finally get to be written down? And how can we be confident? Your son goes to state college and takes a Bible as literature class, and they say, well, you know what? The Bible was written so much later than the Jesus event that there's no way that those stories are accurate to the event, right?
Big time. Big question.
What's the answer to that?
I think I go back again to what are you either wanting to believe or willing to believe?
Correct.
And what's the framework that you're pursuing that in? And I think where a lot of people make mistakes is if they try to apply some modern historical understandings or levels of certainty to texts that was never their intention to try to operate under those kind of categories or framework. And so keep in mind too, when you come to an academic field like history, you kind of are designed to err on the side of skepticism, right? If you're skeptical towards embracing something and you're wrong, you probably won't get a lot of professional fallout from that. But if you make a statement in the positive and then it's wrong, it might look a little worse. And so I think as a field, especially in the modern era, historians and people naturally tend to err on the side of skepticism. And so I think that's where it goes back to, again, to the question, are we looking to prove without a shadow of a doubt? Are we looking to prove something based off of modern historical criteria? Or are we looking at things saying there's grounds and there's reasons to have confidence? And so I think that as a follower of Christ, that third one is really the question we need to ask is there grounds and reasons for confidence? And we can talk to people who might be more skeptical, but I think we might approach it differently if they're looking for a different degree of certainty.
Can I say one thing and then you answer your
Absolutely.
question? In the show notes, just so you know, we're going to give you some sources and some books to go much further and much deeper on this subject that we're dealing with. So look for those. Go ahead.
I'm trying to get into a chronological order, and I think it's fascinating. I was reading the book of Luke, all right? And it was fascinating. I got the commentary from you, and I learned so much. Now I'm trying to read all 4 of the Gospels. And I found it fascinating that Mark is a completely different approach. For one thing, he's so blunt. It's almost funny sometimes. Jesus did this. Live with it. It's kind of, and so I love that, but they're not chronological. It's very different. And I understand. It's hard for me to put my mind around it because when you're talking about history in modern times, we do things chronologically.
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that each of the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptics. So they're sort of dealing with the basic same material. John later did something completely different. Those 3 men, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are all doing something. They're telling a story. They have a purpose to their gospels. And so it isn't necessarily to give you a chronological life of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
You can get a harmony and do that. I'm not a big fan of those, but that's what the harmony of the Gospels do.
Okay.
But they are giving you a message, and each one is basically presenting a different message, right?
Yeah. And I think, again, so let's try to pull ourselves out of the 21st century American world, where we have been accustomed to the printing press for over 500 years,
right,
where we have Microsoft Word that will correct our spelling and typing, where
sometimes incorrectly.
We live in a world of skepticism of fake news.
Yes.
We live in a world of quotations.
Yes.
We live in a world that is so different from that world. And we do not live in an oral world, right? I mean, what is the current attention span of people, or the ability to retain information?
What was he talking about?
Yeah, exactly. And so let me just share some things that people have seen of a different culture in a different time.
Okay.
So one is a scholar named Kenneth Bailey, and he studied Middle Eastern oral tradition. And the things that he observed was that essentially there's different levels and kind of formats of oral tradition and what might be acceptable and things like that. And so there's a variety of things that it was perfectly acceptable in the oral tradition to change, to move time frame, to move these different things, to change some different things. But then other things were off limits. And this was a form of a formal kind of oral tradition. And when we look at the way that this oral tradition is occurring in Middle Eastern countries, we can see a lot of similarity between what we see in the Gospels, that they were operating in a formal type of oral tradition where accuracy was expected, but what we consider accuracy of things may not have been exactly the same kind of things, because for them to demonstrate their confidence as a disciple was not just to regurgitate facts straightforward,
Okay.
but to be able to take what the teaching was and be able to then now take it and create a series and sequence of events and things like that.
Right.
And so Mark can take something, and if he wants to have a common theme, and we see this when we interpret scripture of, there's connections from this event to this event. He's tying themes together. It may not be that these things happen chronologically. Mark is trying to tie these things together. And so there's a school of teaching that they have books of pedagogy, that this is how people would learn in the ancient Greek culture. And it was a practice called kraia. And here's this guy named Theon of Alexandria.
Ooh, cool.
And
You'll be tested on this, by the way.
so he says, this is what kraia looked like. This was the pedagogical practices of someone who was a learner. And so you think of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, those guys would be expected to learn what their teachers taught them.
Okay.
And so in the same way, Theon was a sophist, and he was expected to learn what was he received And then this is what he was free to do and demonstrated his ability to know it. He says, Kriya are practiced by restatement, grammatical inflection, comment and inversion, and we expand and compress the Kriya. Practice by restatement is self-evident, for we try to express the assigned Kriya as best we can with the same words as in the version given us, or with others in the clearest way. So clarity was the emphasis. But to show that they really knew the teacher, they could expand and contract the stories. They could move things around. They could do summaries, and they could do different things and change things in order to have those accounts be uniform with what they were trying to teach. So when we look at the changes and discrepancies and things that come up in the Gospels, it's not a cause for concern. It's really a cause to understand these guys were followers of Christ, and they were operating under the guidelines of what common practices of a disciple or a follower was kind of in those days.
And so Matthew, a follower of Christ, wants to get a particular message to you or to whatever congregation you were a part of. He's going to pull out the stories. He's going to do the timeline that is consistent with what he wants you to understand in his discipleship of Jesus. Luke will do something a bit different, and so will Mark. And Mark probably was influenced by Peter, by the way. And so each of those guys, even though they're taking similar stories and, let's say, putting them in a different framework of timeline, it's according to their purposes, and it's completely consistent with the way that the people would write and speak in those days, even though in our linear historical day, it's not that consistent.
Interesting.
There's a man named Eusebius, and he recorded church history in the 300s.
That's right. He was very, very valuable.
Yes. And in his teachings, in his records of history, he's got statements from a man named Papias, who lived around middle of the 2nd century.
Okay.
And this is what Papias says. He says, this is also the presbyter. The presbyter said, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward, as I said, he followed Peter, who adapted his teaching to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's discourses, so that Mark committed no error, while he thus wrote some things as he remembered them. For he was careful of one thing, not to omit any of the things which he had heard, and not to state any of them falsely. So
that is fascinating to me.
When we see changes happening and those moving around, we need to understand that we can't impose our 21st century criteria of what accuracy is. In the changing around, they were demonstrating their confidence, their accuracy, and they're saying, we do not mess around when it comes to clarity and what we wanted to say,
Correct.
But as a disciple, we can actually move things chronologically around and different things.
So it's kind of like a conversation we might have about the particular history of something, and we go off on a particular direction when it comes to one subject. And he did this and that. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, so we got that clear. Let's go back to when we were talking about this. Is that kind of what we're talking about?
Indeed.
Interesting.
And I think it's important to realize, I'm looking at our time, so we're going to start summarizing here. It's important to realize that the Bible is both a divine book and a human book. Okay. Unlike the Quran, for example, the Quran supposedly is completely the dictation of Allah to Muhammad.
Okay.
So there's no looking at that thing. That's why it has to be in Arabic.
Right.
That you cannot translate it.
Correct.
We don't believe that about the Bible. We believe that it's both a divine book inspired by God and a human book written by man. And so it wasn't just handed down from heaven and here we go. These guys actually wrote it. And so to be able to study a person's style of writing, Matthew wrote different than John, who wrote different than Paul, to appreciate their style of writing, to appreciate the difference in their writings, all of this, the Bible opens itself up to that kind of scholarship and critical study because it's a human book. But it makes it no less spiritual and no less divine because humans had a part in writing it. I think it's important to realize that.
Okay.
I think going back to the other question of, well, what's the question of what we can believe and how kind of skeptical are you when it comes to approaching a text and something like those? And when you think of oral tradition, and people think, well, can oral tradition be trusted? And the idea of comparing what happened in first century Middle Eastern to the idea of what we do when we play telephone is completely bogus. It's night and day difference.
The Jews were really good at making sure that they got the facts straight.
And the Greeks were as well when it came to those. That's what you see with the Kraia there as well, and the practice and things. So, and there was even a word for it that would be a formal kind of thing, talking about handing something down. And so Paul actually uses this word in 1 Corinthians 15. And so what we see, I think, in this account that he gives in 1 Corinthians 15 is an example of captured oral tradition that he has received and now he's handing on. And it's a formal thing that is supposed to be memorized. And why I think this passage is so important is because people don't really debate whether or not Paul's letters were written before 70 AD because of when he died in the late 60s. And so there's less speculation about his death. And then to have this reception of this oral tradition, that puts that even earlier as well. And so, but this is what he says. Now, I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the words I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. And then he says, for I delivered to you, and there's that kind of technical word of I received this, and I delivered to you of first importance, what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. Notice he doesn't say, I'm delivering this to you because I'm an apostle. He's not claiming his apostolic authority to deliver this new message. He's saying, I receive this and I deliver it. And he says that Christ died according to the scriptures, that he was raised according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to these people. So if this is an early, formal, oral tradition, and it says Christ died, he was buried, he was raised again, and he was seen by witnesses. And if we can agree that this is much earlier than the others, and this is solid, and there's no wiggle room in those statements, we've got the gospel right there.
Yeah, very
and
true.
If we can understand and trust that as being authentic, and that as recognizing the early Christian belief that Jesus was in fact what Christians today believe about who he is, just based on that very early oral tradition that he received and put into writing, we have pretty good confidence to come to the Gospels and say, well, where I might have some concern, it's not changing the core Christian beliefs.
Yes.
We're stopping here now. In part 2, we'll talk more about it because this is a big subject and I'm excited about it. It's pretty wonderful. So stay tuned or get ready to go on to the next podcast because we'll have it for you next.